There is something deeply disturbing about the opening of Finding Nemo, especially when you stop watching it as a child and start watching it as an adult. Before there is a joke, before there is a colorful reef, before a single fish says anything remotely funny, there is a family waiting for a future that will never arrive. Marlin and Coral have built a home inside a sea anemone, surrounded by hundreds of eggs, and for a brief moment the film allows us to feel what Marlin feels: anticipation, tenderness, and the almost absurd optimism of believing that the worst thing imaginable could never possibly happen to you. Then the barracuda arrives. The scene is not staged like a conventional animated gag sequence. There is no playful musical cue announcing danger, no exaggerated villain introduction, no comic relief to soften the impact. The camera becomes unstable. The colors darken. Coral moves toward the eggs because instinct tells her that protecting them is worth everything, and Marlin is left unconscious after trying to fight an animal that is vastly more powerful than he is. When he wakes, the reef has been transformed. Coral is gone. The eggs are gone. Almost everything that gave his life meaning has disappeared in a matter of seconds. Only one egg remains, and that single survivor becomes Nemo. The brutality of the moment matters because it explains almost every decision Marlin makes afterward. His fear is not abstract. He has already learned the worst possible lesson: the world can take someone you love without warning, and there may be absolutely nothing you can do about it. That is why his love for Nemo gradually becomes indistinguishable from surveillance. Marlin does not simply worry about his son. He organizes his entire existence around preventing uncertainty. He monitors Nemo's movements, questions his abilities, warns him about everything beyond the anemone, and treats every unfamiliar situation as if it is secretly the barracuda returning. In psychological terms, this resembles hypervigilance, a state in which the mind remains permanently prepared for danger because it has learned that danger can arrive without warning. The tragedy is that Nemo experiences the consequences of a trauma he did not cause. His small, differently shaped fin becomes a reminder of the attack from Marlin, but for Nemo it is simply part of his body. Marlin sees vulnerability. Nemo eventually learns to see possibility. That difference creates the film's central conflict. On the surface, Marlin is the archetypal protective father, the parent who would do anything to keep his child safe. But Finding Nemo quietly dismantles that flattering interpretation. Protection becomes destructive when it leaves no room for another person to become themselves. Marlin's greatest mistake is not loving Nemo too much. It is confusing love with control. If danger is everywhere, then controlling Nemo seems reasonable. If every risk might become another catastrophe, then every boundary feels necessary. But a child cannot grow inside a permanent emergency. The anemone becomes a gilded cage, beautiful and secure but still a cage. Nemo does not initially understand the depth of his father's fear, and Marlin does not understand how suffocating his protection has become. That is why the film's real horror begins long before Nemo is captured. The barracuda attack takes Coral away from Marlin. Marlin's response threatens to take Nemo away from himself. And that is what makes Finding Nemo so much richer than the simple premise of a father crossing the ocean to rescue his son. The journey outward is simultaneously a journey inward. The farther Marlin travels from the reef, the farther he moves from the emotional system he built to survive Coral's death. The ocean becomes more than a setting. It becomes a physical expression of his internal world, enormous, unpredictable, beautiful, terrifying, and impossible to control. Every new environment forces him to confront a different version of the fear he has spent years avoiding. The story therefore works on two levels at once. Children can follow the obvious adventure, while adults can recognize a man slowly discovering that his attempt to eliminate danger has become its own form of danger. To understand how Pixar accomplished that balance, we have to look beyond the plot and into the film's construction. Finding Nemo emerged from an era when Pixar was already famous for transforming simple premises into emotionally sophisticated stories, but this particular project demanded something different. The filmmakers were not just creating a believable ocean. They were creating a world in which scale itself could communicate psychology. Light had to behave differently underwater. Distance had to feel enormous. Darkness had to feel physical. Tiny movements had to remain readable without making the animals behave like floating humans. And underneath all that technical complexity was a difficult storytelling problem. How do you make an anxious, controlling father compelling enough that audiences will stay emotionally attached to him even when his behavior is frustrating? The answer was not to make Marlin instantly likable. It was to make his fear understandable. The film gradually surrounds him with characters who embody alternative ways of responding to uncertainty. Dory lives almost entirely in the present because she cannot reliably hold on to the past. Crush has mastered a form of parenting based on trust rather than constant intervention. Gil has survived captivity by embracing risk, although his own approach can become dangerous. Nemo, meanwhile, has to discover that the weakness his father sees in him is not the whole story. Even the ocean's geography participates in the argument. The warm reef suggests familiarity. The open blue becomes a space of threat and possibility. The dentist's aquarium offers another kind of confinement, where artificial safety can become psychologically suffocating. The deepest parts of the ocean turn darkness into literal uncertainty. And throughout all of it, sound becomes another storytelling instrument, using silence, muffled voices, glass, currents, bubbles, and distant mechanical noises to make the audience feel the environment rather than simply observe it. What looks like a straightforward rescue narrative is therefore an elaborate study in emotional processing. We will eventually see how Pixar's animation technology helped create an ocean that could function almost like a character, how the filmmakers used framing and editing to keep us close to the scale of a small fish, and how Thomas Newman's score gives grief an almost weightless musical language. We will also examine Dory's memory loss, not simply as a source of jokes, but as the thematic opposite of Marlin's inability to let go of the past. We will look at the Tank Gang as a miniature society of creatures adapting to institutional captivity, and at the way Bruce, Crush, and other characters challenge conventional ideas about instinct, family, and survival. The point is not to inflate every detail into a hidden message. The point is to understand why so many details work together so naturally. Finding Nemo rarely announces its themes. It lets them emerge from behavior, space, rhythm, and repetition. That is why its emotional architecture can be easy to miss when we are young. We are too busy following the adventure to notice that the adventure has been designed around a psychological transformation. Most people encounter Finding Nemo for the first time as children, and that first experience is almost completely dominated by Nemo's perspective. The reef feels small because Nemo wants it to be bigger. School feels exciting because it represents independence. The drop-off is irresistible because everything beyond it is unknown. When the divers arrive, the ocean suddenly becomes a gigantic playground of dangers and possibilities. Nemo's frustration with Marlin feels familiar because childhood naturally contains the desire to separate from parental authority. A child does not necessarily understand why a parent says no. The restriction itself becomes the story. But adulthood changes the camera angle. The same film suddenly becomes a nightmare about losing a child. The drop-off no longer looks like a simple argument between an adventurous son and an overprotective father. It looks like the exact moment a terrified parent realizes that the boundary he built cannot contain another human being forever. The brilliance is that both readings remain valid. Finding Nemo does not ask us to choose between Nemo and Marlin. It asks us to understand why both of them are right about something and wrong about something. Nemo is right that he needs room to grow. Marlin is right that the world contains genuine danger. The emotional problem is that Marlin has allowed the existence of danger to become an argument against freedom itself. That tension has only become more recognizable with time. In an age of constant information, parents can know where their children are, what they are doing, who they are talking to, and what dangers might exist around them. The modern world can feel simultaneously safer and more threatening because every disaster is only a notification away. Finding Nemo understands the psychological temptation hidden inside that environment. If information makes us aware of every possible danger, it can become almost impossible to accept uncertainty. Marlin's instinct is therefore not alien. It is painfully human. That is one reason the movie has remained powerful across generations. Millennials who watched Nemo as children can now revisit the film as adults and discover that the character they once considered annoying may now be the person they understand most deeply. Gen Z viewers can inherit the same emotional reversal, recognizing that independence and protection are not simple opposites. A child can resent the cage while still needing the person who built it. A parent can build the cage out of love and still have to learn how to open it. The film's emotional power comes from refusing to simplify that contradiction. Nemo is not wrong for wanting freedom, and Marlin is not wrong for being afraid. What must change is the way fear governs their relationship. That is why Finding Nemo remains one of Pixar's most emotionally potent original stories. Its surface is bright enough for children, but its emotional foundation is built from grief, anxiety, separation, trust, and the terrifying realization that loving someone means accepting that you cannot control what happens to them. The child sees an adventure across the sea. The adult sees a father learning that survival is not the same thing as living. The personal seed of that idea has often been associated with director Andrew Stanton's own realization about parenting, the recognition that spending all his energy protecting his child could prevent him from actually enjoying being with him. That insight gives the story a remarkably intimate foundation. Marlin is not written as an evil parent or even an incompetent one. He is written as someone whose best quality has become distorted by fear. He cares deeply. He notices everything. He is constantly thinking ahead. He is willing to sacrifice himself without hesitation. Those are normally heroic characteristics. But the film asks what happens when vigilance becomes so extreme that it prevents another person from developing independence. Pixar's creative environment at the time was particularly suited to that kind of emotional experimentation. The studio had already established a reputation for building stories around deceptively simple premises, but Finding Nemo required the filmmakers to trust a protagonist who could initially be difficult to tolerate. Marlin's neurosis had to remain visible without turning him into a caricature. The audience needed to feel his exhaustion, not simply laugh at it. His anxiety also had to be translated into animation. In a live-action film, a nervous character can communicate fear through tiny physical behaviors, but an animated clownfish has no eyebrows in the conventional human sense and no familiar human body language. Pixar therefore had to make the eyes, fins, mouth, posture, movement, and framing carry psychological information. At the same time, the ocean itself presented an enormous technical challenge. Water is one of the hardest natural environments to reproduce convincingly because it is transparent and opaque at the same time. Light penetrates it, scatters through it, reflects from surfaces, disappears into depth, and changes according to suspended particles. A completely realistic digital ocean could easily become visually confusing or emotionally unreadable. Pixar had to construct a stylized version of reality in which the audience could believe the environment without losing the characters inside it. That meant creating convincing water movement, caustic lighting, atmospheric depth, particulate matter, bubbles, reflections, and changing visibility while maintaining the clean visual storytelling necessary for animation. The irony is that the film's realism had to be carefully controlled. If everything looked too real, the characters could disappear into the complexity of the environment. If everything looked too simple, the ocean would lose its physical presence. The final result sits between those extremes, allowing the world to feel enormous while keeping the emotional focus precise. That same principle shaped the writing. Marlin's journey could not simply be a collection of underwater obstacles. Every obstacle needed to attack a different part of his worldview. The ocean had to make him feel small. Dory had to disrupt his obsession with control. Nemo had to encounter situations where someone other than his father could help him. And the tank gang had to demonstrate that confinement can produce its own strange forms of resilience. Early concerns about Marlin's temperament were therefore not a problem to be eliminated but a dramatic opportunity. If the protagonist begins in a state of emotional imbalance, then the plot can function as a mechanism for changing him. The story becomes less about whether he will reach Sydney and more about what kind of father he will be when he gets there. That distinction is crucial. Rescue is the external objective. Transformation is the real narrative. The timing of Finding Nemo's release made that gamble even more interesting. In 2003, computer animation had already become a dominant force, but the industry was still negotiating what animated movies were supposed to be. DreamWorks had demonstrated the commercial power of irreverent humor and pop culture parody through Shrek, while Disney's traditional hand-drawn identity was under increasing pressure from the rapid rise of computer-generated imagery. Audiences had learned that animated films could be visually sophisticated, commercially enormous, and packed with jokes aimed at adults. Against that backdrop, Finding Nemo was taking a curious risk. Its premise was simple, but its emotional center was unusually serious. The movie opened with bereavement. Its protagonist suffered from a deep fear of loss. Its story involved abduction, captivity, separation, and the possibility of death. Yet it was being presented as a bright summer adventure filled with colorful fish. The marketing could emphasize spectacle, humor, and the strange charm of an underwater world because revealing the full emotional weight of the story would have made it harder to sell as a family event. Pixar's advantage was that it had already trained audiences to expect emotional surprises. The studio did not need to choose between comedy and seriousness. It could place them next to each other. A scene could be terrifying and then become funny without completely erasing what came before. That tonal elasticity became one of Finding Nemo's greatest strengths. The decline of traditional 2D animation also made the film's technical achievement feel significant. Pixar's digital characters could move through a world that would have been enormously difficult to animate traditionally at the same level of environmental complexity. But technology alone could not guarantee success. A beautifully rendered ocean without compelling characters would have been little more than a demonstration reel. The challenge was to make the technology invisible enough that viewers stopped thinking about how the water was created and started believing that the characters actually lived inside it. The film's marketing therefore had to sell the dream of the ocean while the story quietly carried something much heavier underneath. Bright colors became a gateway into grief. Cute fish became vessels for adult anxiety. Comedy became a pressure valve. And the familiar Pixar structure of an impossible journey became a psychological test. The result was a movie that could compete in a marketplace obsessed with jokes without abandoning sincerity. That sincerity would become one of its most enduring qualities. The opening tragedy does more than establish backstory. It establishes the rules of Marlin's mind. After Coral's death, the reef is no longer simply home. It is the last remaining territory he can control. The anemone is physically small, but emotionally enormous because it represents everything Marlin has left. Nemo grows up inside that protected space, and the framing repeatedly emphasizes how enclosed his world is. The reef is warm, colorful, and beautiful, yet Marlin's constant warnings create an invisible perimeter around it. He is raising Nemo inside a memorial to Coral without realizing that he is also raising him inside his own trauma. Nemo's unusual fin intensifies that anxiety. It becomes a visible reminder that the surviving child is vulnerable. But the film carefully avoids making Nemo's difference synonymous with weakness. Nemo can swim. He can learn. He can make decisions. He can be stubborn, curious, funny, and brave. The problem is not his fin. The problem is the meaning Marlin attaches to it. When Nemo begins school, the excitement of independence collides with the father's fear. Marlin sees every possible threat in the open water. Nemo sees an invitation. Their conflict is therefore inevitable because they are looking at the same environment through completely different emotional histories. The drop-off sequence becomes powerful precisely because nothing enormous has happened yet. The danger is psychological before it becomes physical. Nemo wants to go closer to the boat. Marlin wants him to stay away. Their argument is about a few meters of ocean, but symbolically it is about the entire future of their relationship. When Nemo finally swims out, he is not simply disobeying. He is testing whether his father is right about the world. Then the divers arrive, and Marlin's worst prediction becomes reality. The abduction sequence is deliberately abrupt. The earlier rhythm of family conversation is shattered by movement, distance, and sound. Nemo becomes tiny against the enormous boat and the surrounding sea. Marlin's inability to stop the divers echoes the original Barracuda attack. Once again, the world has taken something from him, and once again he is physically powerless to prevent it. But this time he refuses to remain unconscious. He follows. That decision marks the beginning of his transformation. The father who spent years making the world smaller must now enter the largest possible version of it. He cannot protect Nemo from the ocean by hiding inside the reef. He has to enter the ocean himself. For Marlin, the open sea is almost an exposure therapy session disguised as an adventure movie. Every kilometer forces him to confront the uncertainty he has avoided. The search begins with frantic energy because panic can create the illusion of control. If he moves fast enough, asks enough questions, and follows every possible clue, perhaps he can outrun the possibility that Nemo is gone. But the ocean does not reward that mindset. It introduces Dory almost immediately, and she becomes the perfect disruption. Marlin wants information, continuity, and a clear objective. Dory offers none of these consistently. She forgets. She wanders. She improvises. She misinterprets. Yet she also notices things Marlin does not. Her presence forces him to react to the present instead of constantly rehearsing the past. Their relationship is funny because their personalities clash, but the comedy has a structural purpose. Marlin is trying to turn the ocean into a map. Dory keeps reminding him that the ocean is alive and unpredictable. The abduction itself also changes the film's visual language. The calm reef gives way to rapid movement and unfamiliar scale. The diver's mask becomes the only tangible clue Marlin possesses, and its address in Sydney transforms a frightening object into a destination. From that point onward, the search acquires a strange paradox. Marlin finally has a goal, but reaching that goal requires him to surrender almost every familiar form of control. He must rely on strangers. He must enter dark spaces. He must trust Dory even though he cannot understand her memory. He must communicate with creatures whose behavior he cannot predict. And eventually he must accept that Nemo's fate may be outside his reach. The first major obstacles reinforce that lesson. The minefield does not care how frightened Marlin is. The sharks do not care how desperately he wants to find his son. The abyss certainly does not care about his plans. The world is not conspiring against him. It is simply indifferent. That indifference is what makes the ocean such an effective antagonist. There is no mastermind behind Marlin's suffering. There is only a universe in which danger and beauty coexist. His challenge is therefore not defeating an enemy but learning how to function inside uncertainty. The shark sequence captures that idea through comedy. Bruce, Chum, and Anchor have created a support group designed around the idea that predators can redefine themselves. Their slogan about fish being friends rather than food is absurd on the surface, but the absurdity conceals a real tension between instinct and identity. Bruce genuinely wants to become something different from what he is expected to be. His struggle is comic because the audience knows that he is a shark and the other fish are, by definition, his natural prey. Yet the movie also understands that suppression is not the same as transformation. When the smell of blood triggers Bruce, the scene becomes dangerous precisely because his good intentions are not enough. The relapse reminds us that instinct cannot simply be wished away. Marlin survives because circumstances intervene, but the experience reinforces his belief that the world is full of variables that can suddenly become lethal. Meanwhile, Nemo's story moves in the opposite direction. He wakes inside the dentist's aquarium, a miniature artificial ocean that is both safe and imprisoning. The tank gang has created its own social system around captivity. Gil, the scarred leader, immediately recognizes something in Nemo, not just vulnerability, but potential. Gil encourages Nemo to take risks because he understands that passive survival inside a tank can become another kind of death. This creates a fascinating parallel. Marlin believes danger comes from leaving safety. Gil believes safety can itself become dangerous. Both are reacting to captivity in opposite ways. Nemo stands between them. He has to learn that courage does not mean ignoring danger, but neither does caution mean refusing to live. The aquarium sequences therefore mirror Marlin's journey. In the ocean, Marlin is trapped by his fear of losing Nemo. Inside the tank, Nemo is trapped by the circumstances of his captivity. Both father and son are trying to find a way out, but they must develop different kinds of agency to do it. The East Australian current temporarily transforms the film into something almost euphoric. Marlin and Dory are swept into a living highway of movement, surrounded by sea turtles who seem to have mastered the art of moving through danger without becoming consumed by fear. Crush's attitude toward his son, Squirt, is perhaps the clearest alternative to Marlin's parenting philosophy. Crush does not pretend the ocean is safe. He simply understands that his child must experience it. When Squirt falls, Crush allows him to recover. When Squirt takes risks, Crush watches rather than immediately intervening. The difference is not neglect. It is confidence. Crush trusts that the lessons his child needs cannot all be taught through warnings. Marlin is fascinated by this philosophy even before he consciously recognizes why. The EAC gives him a temporary experience of moving with the world rather than fighting it. But the relief cannot last. When Marlin and Dory finally reach Sydney, they encounter another devastating misunderstanding. Nemo has been placed inside a plastic bag as part of the tank gang's escape plan, and from Marlin's perspective the image looks like confirmation of his deepest fear. He believes Nemo is dead. The emotional cruelty of the moment comes from the audience knowing that Nemo is alive while Marlin does not. The film uses dramatic irony to make his collapse feel inevitable. He has spent the entire journey preparing himself for the worst, and now the worst appears to have arrived. His response is not explosive anger. It is surrender. He abandons Dory and begins moving back toward home. That retreat is crucial because it shows that physical distance alone cannot heal trauma. Marlin has crossed an ocean and still carries the same fear he had at the reef. He has not yet learned the lesson. He still believes that if he cannot guarantee Nemo's safety, then hope itself is dangerous. Dory's reaction becomes one of the film's quietest emotional blows. For someone who cannot reliably remember the past, the possibility of losing Marlin in the present is devastating. She begs him not to leave, and the relationship they built becomes evidence that Marlin has changed more than he realizes. He entered the ocean for Nemo. Along the way, he created another bond worth protecting. Nemo's escape from the aquarium and Marlin's return toward the sea eventually converge around the same idea: survival requires cooperation. Nemo's agency becomes essential because the final rescue cannot be completed by a father who insists on doing everything himself. When the fishing net captures the school, Marlin is confronted with a problem that cannot be solved through individual strength. The fish must move together. Nemo understands this before Marlin does. The child who once needed his father to protect him now possesses knowledge that his father lacks. That reversal is the emotional climax of the story. Marlin has spent the film assuming that his experience makes him the authority on danger. Yet Nemo's experience inside the tank has taught him something different. Sometimes the way out requires trusting a group and using your own abilities. Marlin's crucial act is therefore not swimming harder. It is listening. He allows Nemo to lead. He trusts the child whose vulnerability he once used as evidence that he could never be trusted. The fishing net becomes a physical representation of the old relationship. Marlin can either hold Nemo back and keep him individually safe for a few seconds, or trust him and allow him to participate in the solution. The choice is terrifying because there is no guarantee. That is the entire point. Growth requires action without certainty. When the fish escape together, the victory feels earned not because Marlin has defeated danger, but because he has finally accepted that Nemo can face danger without him controlling every move. Their eventual return to the reef completes the visual and emotional circle. Earlier, the school drop-off represented separation and rebellion. Now the same basic situation carries a different emotional meaning. Marlin still cares. He still worries. But his worry no longer dictates Nemo's every movement. The reef is still home, but it is no longer a prison. Nemo can leave and return. Marlin can let him go without believing that letting go means losing him. The ending therefore does not promise a world without danger. It promises something more believable. A family that has learned how to live despite danger. Marlin is one of Pixar's most unusual protagonists because his central flaw is simultaneously his greatest virtue. He is attentive, loyal, intelligent, and deeply committed to his child. But chronic fear has converted those qualities into compulsive behaviors. His mind constantly searches for catastrophic possibilities. A minor risk becomes a potential disaster. An unfamiliar creature becomes a threat. An independent decision becomes a possible death sentence. His psychological pattern resembles catastrophic thinking, in which the mind moves from possibility to certainty without pausing between the two. Nemo could get hurt, therefore Nemo will get hurt. The ocean is dangerous, therefore Nemo must stay away from it. A child can be lost, therefore the only responsible parent is one who prevents every opportunity for loss. Marlin's fear also has an almost agoraphobic quality because open spaces themselves become emotionally charged. The reef offers boundaries. The open ocean offers infinite variables. His body language reflects this. Early Marlin often seems tense even when nothing is happening. He moves quickly, speaks defensively, and reacts to possibilities before they become actual events. There is another fascinating contradiction hidden in his characterization. He is a clownfish, but he is not especially funny at the beginning. The species gives Pixar an obvious opportunity for visual comedy, yet Marlin's personality suppresses it. His humor is buried under anxiety. That makes his eventual comic rhythm with Dory feel like evidence of psychological change. Dory does not simply make him laugh. She makes room for a version of him that had been buried beneath vigilance. The journey slowly loosens his grip. He starts by rejecting Dory's unpredictability, then reluctantly tolerates it, and eventually depends on it. He begins by seeing strangers as threats and ends by surviving because strangers help him. Most importantly, he learns that protecting Nemo does not mean preventing every painful experience. A parent cannot remove the ocean from a child's life. They can only help the child develop the confidence to swim through it. Marlin's healing is therefore not a complete disappearance of fear. That would be psychologically false. He remains concerned. What changes is the relationship between fear and action. At the beginning, fear controls him. At the end, he can feel fear and still trust Nemo. That is a much more mature definition of courage. The film's antagonists are equally unusual because there is no traditional villain driving the plot. The barracuda is an animal behaving according to instinct. The diver who captures Nemo is not presented as a sadistic kidnapper. He sees a fish and takes it. Darla is dangerous because she is careless and immature, not because she understands the suffering she causes. The dentist himself is more complicated, but even he does not function as a conventional villain. This absence of a central evil force strengthens the film's psychological argument. Marlin is not fighting someone who can be defeated. He is fighting a world that does not promise safety. Human beings represent one form of danger because they possess enormous power over creatures they barely understand. The diver can remove Nemo from the ocean with a simple gesture. Darla can shake an aquarium without understanding what that does to the fish. The threat is partly ignorance. The movie never needs these humans to be monsters because indifference can be frightening enough. Bruce offers another version of the same idea. He is not evil. He is a predator attempting to resist his own nature. His support group turns the food chain into a 12-step comedy, but underneath the joke is a serious question about whether identity can be separated from instinct. Bruce's relapse demonstrates the danger of denying reality. He can choose his behavior, but he cannot pretend he is not a shark. In a similar way, Marlin cannot pretend the ocean is safe. He must accept its danger without allowing that danger to dictate his entire life. The ocean itself therefore becomes the ultimate antagonist and perhaps the most honest one. It is beautiful, violent, unpredictable, and indifferent. It does not hate Marlin. It does not care about him. It simply exists. That indifference is terrifying because it removes the comforting possibility that defeating one enemy will make everything safe. There will always be another current, another predator, another storm, another human mistake. The film's answer is not to conquer the ocean. It is to learn how to move through it. Dory, Gil, and Crush function as mirrors because each one exposes a different weakness in Marlin's worldview. Dory is the most obvious opposite. Marlin remembers too much. Dory cannot reliably remember enough. His life is structured around the past, especially the moment he lost Coral. Her life is almost entirely structured around the present because the past keeps slipping away. At first, her memory problem appears to be comic chaos. She forgets names, loses track of conversations, and repeats information. But the longer the film continues, the more profound her condition becomes. Dory has no reliable guarantee that tomorrow will make sense, yet she keeps moving. Her famous philosophy of continuing forward is not simply motivational optimism. It is a survival mechanism. She cannot solve uncertainty by remembering everything, so she responds by refusing to stop. Marlin, meanwhile, remembers the defining trauma of his life so vividly that it controls his present. Their partnership works because each possesses what the other lacks. Dory needs Marlin's continuity and focus. Marlin needs Dory's ability to remain present. Gil offers another mirror. He is scarred, experienced, and fiercely determined to escape confinement. He encourages Nemo to take risks because he believes that fear itself can become a prison. Yet Gil also projects his own desires onto Nemo. His methods are not purely healthy. He wants Nemo to become the kind of creature who can escape because Gil desperately wants escape himself. In that sense, Gil resembles Marlin more than either would like to admit. Both adults project their histories onto the child. Marlin says, in effect, "You are too fragile because I lost someone." Gil says, "You are capable because I need you to prove it." Nemo has to find the space between those projections. Crush represents the healthiest alternative. His relaxed parenting is not based on ignorance but on trust. He understands that Squirt will eventually encounter currents he cannot control. Instead of teaching him that danger must be avoided, he teaches him that danger can be navigated. That distinction sits at the center of the film's philosophy. The goal of parenting is not to make the world harmless. It is to prepare another person to move through a world that will never be harmless. At the center of Finding Nemo is a painful paradox. Love naturally creates the desire to protect, but complete protection is impossible. Marlin's promise that he will never let anything happen to Nemo sounds beautiful because it expresses absolute devotion. Yet taken literally, it is impossible. Something will happen. Childhood includes disappointment, fear, injury, failure, embarrassment, and eventually loss. A parent cannot eliminate those experiences without eliminating the child's opportunity to become independent. The promise therefore becomes toxic when Marlin interprets it as a contract with the universe. He behaves as though vigilance can make the promise true. But the film's entire journey demonstrates the opposite. The more he tries to control everything, the less prepared Nemo becomes to navigate the world without him. Trauma creates the illusion that if we identify the original mistake, we can prevent the same pain from happening again. Marlin's problem is that Coral's death teaches him to treat possibility as probability. If one child was taken from him, then any separation feels like the beginning of another catastrophe. Dory's philosophy challenges that mindset from the other direction. Her inability to hold on to the past means she cannot construct her life around old pain in the same way. She forgets, but she also continues. Her famous persistence becomes a counterargument to Marlin's obsessive memory. Neither extreme is perfect. Forgetting everything is not the same as healing, and remembering everything is not the same as wisdom. Healing requires remembering without allowing memory to dictate every future decision. The film also insists on community. Marlin survives because he trusts beings he initially considers strangers or threats. Sharks help. Turtles guide. Whales communicate. Pelicans carry information. Dory becomes family. The message is almost radical in its simplicity. Independence does not mean doing everything alone. True independence can involve knowing when to accept help. That is why the film repeatedly surrounds its characters with unlikely forms of interdependence. The ocean is dangerous individually but survivable collectively. A school of fish can defeat a net that one fish could never escape. A group can turn vulnerability into strength. The family at the center of the story expands beyond blood. Marlin begins by believing that only he can protect Nemo. He ends by understanding that Nemo belongs to a world larger than their private relationship. Pixar's visual language reinforces these themes before the dialogue ever explains them. The reef is warm, saturated, and densely populated. Its colors communicate abundance and familiarity. The open ocean often shifts toward colder blues, with greater negative space and less visual certainty. This is not a simple equation in which warm equals good and blue equals evil. The ocean is beautiful precisely because it is dangerous. But the difference in palette allows the audience to feel Marlin's psychological displacement. The dentist's tank introduces murky greens and artificial lighting, creating a strange imitation of the natural world. It is colorful but enclosed. The fish have objects, structures, and routines, yet they are still prisoners. The film repeatedly uses scale to create emotional meaning. A tiny fish surrounded by enormous water feels vulnerable even when nothing is attacking it. A close-up can suddenly make a familiar character feel trapped. A wide shot can reduce Marlin to a small point in an overwhelming environment. The diver's mask becomes one of the most important objects because it contains the address that gives Marlin a direction. It is both evidence of the human world and the only path toward Nemo. Rubber and glass become a tether between two worlds. Marlin cannot control the human who took his son, but he can follow the clue that human being accidentally left behind. Later, the whales sequence deepens the film's symbolism through darkness. Marlin and Dory enter an enormous creature and initially have no idea where they are going. In mythological storytelling, entering the belly of a whale often represents death, transformation, or rebirth. Here, the darkness becomes the condition through which salvation arrives. Marlin cannot see the path. He has to trust Dory and the whale's movement. The idea is consistent with the larger emotional structure. Letting go of control does not guarantee safety, but refusing to let go can make safety impossible. Even the most frightening spaces in the film can contain a route forward. The visual world therefore behaves like a psychological map. Warmth can become confinement. Darkness can contain possibility. Vastness can create terror and freedom at the same time. The film never needs to explain these contradictions because the audience feels them through space. Nemo's lucky fin adds another layer because the film refuses to turn physical difference into a tragic identity. His fin affects how others perceive him, especially Marlin, but Nemo himself does not spend the entire film defining his existence through it. The difference matters, but it does not consume the character. That is a subtle form of representation because the film allows Nemo to be mischievous, insecure, adventurous, frightened, clever, and loving without reducing him to disability. Marlin's mistake is interpreting difference as a permanent forecast of weakness. Nemo's growth involves proving that capability cannot be measured only by physical symmetry. The Tank Gang introduces a darker institutional reading. Their aquarium is clean, colorful, and controlled, but it is still an artificial environment. Each member has developed specialized habits for coping with confinement. Gil has turned escape into an obsession. Bloat has anxiety rituals. Peach watches everything. Jacques is preoccupied with cleanliness. The group resembles a miniature institution in which captivity shapes personality. The implication is not that every structured environment is evil, but that prolonged confinement changes the way beings understand themselves. Nemo initially enters the tank as an individual who has been separated from his family. He gradually becomes part of a community with its own culture. That community helps him survive, but it also teaches him that he can contribute. His identity shifts from the child who needs rescuing to the fish who can solve problems. The abyss sequence provides the film's most literal encounter with existential darkness. Marlin and Dory enter an environment where visibility collapses and the anglofish's light becomes both lure and threat. The light is beautiful precisely because it is dangerous. It represents how human perception can be manipulated by appearances. In the deepest darkness, the characters cannot rely on familiar visual information. They must listen, react, and trust one another. The sequence is frightening because the ocean has become almost completely unreadable. Yet the film repeatedly returns to the idea that uncertainty does not mean emptiness. There may be something beyond what we can currently see. That is perhaps the most important symbolic lesson of the entire movie. Fear often interprets darkness as proof that something terrible is waiting. The story asks us to consider another possibility. Darkness may simply mean we have not learned how to see yet. The technical achievement behind this illusion was enormous. Underwater animation creates problems that do not exist in ordinary environments because almost every visual element is affected by the water itself. Light is filtered. Objects lose contrast with distance. Particles float through the frame. Movement becomes fluid and multidirectional. Reflections and caustics shift constantly. Pixar's artists had to simulate enough of these properties to make the ocean convincing while deliberately controlling them so the audience could still understand what was happening. The too realistic problem is particularly revealing. Photorealism is not automatically better in animation. If every particle, reflection, and fluctuation behaves with absolute realism, the image can become visually noisy. The viewer may believe the water but lose the character. Pixar therefore had to stylize reality, selectively emphasizing the physical behaviors that supported storytelling and suppressing those that distracted from it. Background environments could suggest depth without becoming impossible to read. Light could ripple across surfaces without turning every shot into a technical demonstration. Floating matter could make the water feel alive without obscuring faces and bodies. The result is an illusion of physical complexity built around emotional clarity. Character animation presented another challenge. Fish do not have human shoulders, hands, or eyebrows, yet Pixar needed them to communicate sophisticated emotions. Nemo's body language had to remain fish-like while his eyes, mouth, fins, and swimming patterns carried the emotional information normally expressed through a human actor. Marlin's nervous energy appears through abrupt movement and rigid posture. Dory's personality emerges through rhythm, drifting motion, and constantly changing orientation. The characters are appealing without becoming completely anthropomorphic. They still feel like fish moving through water rather than people wearing fins. That balance is one of the film's greatest technical successes. The environment also had to obey its own physical logic. Water cannot simply be treated as invisible air. Characters accelerate differently. Distance behaves differently. Sound behaves differently. Light disappears differently. All of these elements contribute to the feeling that the ocean is a real volume rather than a painted background. The technology matters because it allows the story's metaphor to become physical. Marlin's psychological journey would be less convincing if the ocean felt like a generic cartoon setting. Instead, every technical decision helps turn his internal uncertainty into something the audience can see. Andrew Stanton and Lee Unkrish's direction also depends heavily on scale. The camera generally respects the perspective of creatures who are tiny compared with the environments around them. A human boat is enormous. A diver is terrifyingly large. A whale is almost incomprehensible. Even ordinary distances can become epic when measured from the perspective of a clownfish. This scale keeps the emotional stakes grounded. The audience never forgets that Marlin and Nemo are small creatures moving through an environment that was not built for them. At the same time, the camera knows when to become intimate. Close-ups of eyes and faces compress the ocean into a tiny emotional space. The alternation between enormous wide shots and intimate close-ups creates a rhythm of vulnerability and connection. Cross-cutting becomes especially important once Nemo enters the dentist's tank. The film can move from Marlin's dangerous ocean journey to the tank gang's almost sitcom-like conversations without making either storyline feel detached. The contrast is purposeful. Marlin is trapped by vastness. Nemo is trapped by confinement. One character has too much space and the other has too little. Both are searching for a way to reconnect with the person they love. This parallel structure allows the film to maintain suspense while developing two different forms of agency. The direction also understands the power of silence. Some of the most intense moments are not accompanied by constant music or dialogue. Sound can suddenly drop away, leaving a character isolated inside the frame. The Barracuda attack benefits from this restraint because the audience has time to register the horror instead of being told how to feel. Similarly, the moments when Marlin believes Nemo is dead work because the emotional space around him becomes almost empty. Silence is not the absence of storytelling. It is storytelling stripped down to its most basic form. The comedy works because the filmmakers know when to interrupt tension and when not to. Dory can be hilarious moments after something frightening without making the frightening event meaningless. The film treats tonal shifts as part of emotional reality. Real people often laugh when overwhelmed. They make jokes during crises. They cling to absurd details because the alternative is panic. Finding Nemo understands that rhythm instinctively. Thomas Newman's score gives that emotional architecture another dimension. Instead of relying on the constant bombast often associated with animated adventure, Newman creates a musical world that feels fluid, impressionistic, and slightly mysterious. Piano figures can appear like isolated drops of sound. Percussion introduces movement without always announcing conventional heroic triumph. Orchestral textures create atmosphere rather than simply underlining plot points. This approach is particularly effective because the ocean itself is difficult to translate into music. It has no fixed rhythm. Currents move unpredictably. Sound travels differently underwater. Newman's score therefore avoids making the ocean feel like a generic fantasy landscape. Instead, it often feels suspended, spacious, and slightly alien. The emotional material associated with Nemo and Marlin carries a sense of beauty mixed with loss. The score can suggest grief without turning every sad moment into melodrama. That restraint is essential because the film already contains enormous emotional stakes. If the music constantly screamed "This is tragic," the audience would become exhausted. Newman instead allows melancholy to exist underneath the surface. When the story accelerates, particularly during sequences involving the East Australian current, the music becomes more propulsive and energetic. The contrast is important. Marlin's journey is not emotionally uniform. There are periods of panic, wonder, exhaustion, exhilaration, and despair. The score moves with those states rather than imposing a single mood on the entire movie. Dissonant textures become especially useful in the deep ocean, where conventional musical beauty would almost undermine the alien quality of the environment. The anglerfish sequence sounds unlike the warm reef because it should feel like a descent into a place the characters do not understand. Music becomes part of the geography. It tells us that the rules have changed. Even when the image is beautiful, the sound can warn us that beauty is not the same as safety. Sound design makes the ocean tactile. Gary Rydstrom's work gives the film an auditory identity that is easy to overlook because it feels natural. Scuba regulators, bubbles, glass, distant engines, muffled voices, currents, and underwater movement all contribute to a sense of physical presence. The dentist's aquarium has its own acoustic personality. Glass tapping creates a hard boundary between the fish and the human world. The ocean outside the tank feels expansive, while the tank produces a more enclosed sound field. For Marlon, this kind of auditory claustrophobia mirrors his psychological state. The world keeps surrounding him with reminders that he cannot control what is happening. Human sounds are particularly unsettling because they represent a civilization that the fish cannot understand. The diver's equipment sounds mechanical and alien. The dentist's office contains noises that have nothing to do with the natural rhythms of the reef. Even the whale's vocalizations make communication feel enormous and mysterious. Voice performance then adds another layer. Albert Brooks gives Marlon a nervous, rapid-fire cadence that often sounds like his thoughts are moving faster than his ability to process them. The performance is funny, but the comedy comes from anxiety rather than from a detached comic persona. Ellen DeGeneres creates a completely different rhythm for Dory. Her delivery can feel impulsive, childlike, musical, and emotionally immediate. That contrast is central to their chemistry. Marlon speaks as someone constantly trying to stabilize the world. Dory speaks as someone who keeps moving through it. Their voices alone tell us why they clash and why they need each other. By the time the film reaches its ending, the famous version of Beyond the Sea provides a striking release. After so much uncertainty, the familiar theatrical song makes the ocean feel almost celebratory. The film has taken us through grief, fear, captivity, darkness, and separation, yet it ends with a musical language associated with classic romance and adventure. It is a reminder that the story was never about defeating the sea. It was about learning to belong inside it. When Finding Nemo reached theaters in 2003, its emotional gamble paid off on an extraordinary scale. The movie became a cultural event as much as a critical success. Its worldwide theatrical performance pushed it beyond the expectations of a typical animated release, eventually reaching more than $870 million during its original run and becoming the highest-grossing animated film of its era. But numbers alone cannot explain the impact. Critics recognized that the movie was doing something unusually sophisticated with family storytelling. It could be visually spectacular without allowing spectacle to replace character. It could be funny without turning its emotional subjects into jokes. It could address grief, anxiety, disability, captivity, and parental control without assuming children were incapable of understanding difficult emotions. Audiences responded because the basic family dynamic was universal. Almost everyone understands what it feels like to want more freedom than someone else is willing to give. Almost everyone understands the fear of losing someone. Almost everyone has experienced a moment when a parent, friend, or loved one tried to protect them in a way that felt suffocating. The movie's phrases quickly escaped the boundaries of the film. "Just keep swimming" became shorthand for persistence. The Sydney address became one of those details that viewers could repeat from memory. "Fish are friends, not food" became an instantly recognizable joke. The characters themselves became cultural icons. Dory's expressions, Bruce's grin, Darla's braces, and Nemo's tiny fin entered the visual vocabulary of the early 2000s. But the most impressive aspect of the film's reception was not that people remembered its jokes. It was that they remembered its emotional logic. Viewers remembered what it felt like when Marlin believed Nemo was dead. They remembered the terror of the fishing net. They remembered the relief of seeing father and son reunited. The comedy made the film accessible, but the emotional structure made it unforgettable. The long-term legacy is more complicated because the movie's cultural influence reached beyond entertainment. Finding Nemo became associated with a real-world phenomenon involving increased interest in keeping clownfish as pets, sometimes described through the shorthand Nemo effect. The irony is difficult to ignore. A movie that repeatedly presents the ocean as a living ecosystem and depicts captivity as emotionally troubling could simultaneously inspire more people to purchase marine fish. That does not mean the film caused every environmental problem connected to the marine aquarium trade, but the cultural association was strong enough to produce conservation conversations about responsible ownership and the protection of wild populations. The phenomenon reveals how unpredictable the relationship between art and behavior can be. A story can communicate one message while an audience responds to a completely different element. Some viewers saw Nemo and wanted to own a clownfish. Others saw Nemo and became more interested in marine conservation. The film's characters also survived through the rise of internet meme culture. Dory's expressions became reaction images. Darla's unsettling smile became a shorthand for chaotic behavior. Bruce's slogans became jokes detached from the original context. The characters remained useful because their personalities were visually immediate. The movie also expanded into theme parks and live entertainment. Turtle Talk with Crush became a particularly successful example of interactive character performance, allowing audiences to engage with a digital representation of Crush in a way that blurred the boundary between attraction and theatrical improvisation. The broader Disney ecosystem embraced the film's characters because they were immediately recognizable and emotionally flexible. Yet the strongest legacy remains the film itself. 2 decades later, Finding Nemo can still be watched without nostalgia and remain effective. Its cultural footprint matters, but its survival as a piece of storytelling matters more. The unusual thing about Finding Nemo's critical reputation is how closely it aligned with audience affection. Films aimed at families often face a critical trap. Reviewers may praise technical craft while audiences care mostly about characters, or critics may admire ambition while children simply want entertainment. Finding Nemo largely avoided that divide. High-profile critics such as Roger Ebert recognized its emotional and visual strengths, while general audiences responded to the same qualities in less academic language. That convergence happened because Pixar did not treat children as an audience that needed simpler emotions. The movie assumes that young viewers can understand grief even if they do not have adult vocabulary for it. It assumes they can recognize an anxious parent without being told that anxiety is the subject. It assumes that a child can hold 2 contradictory feelings at once. My father loves me and my father is making me miserable. That emotional complexity helped the movie remain competitive with other major animated releases throughout the 2000s. Its appeal was not dependent on a particular pop culture reference or a temporary comedy style. It was built around family dynamics that could survive changes in fashion. The film also benefited from its refusal to make every character morally simple. Marlon is frustrating but sympathetic. Gil is brave but reckless. Dory is vulnerable but resilient. The dentist is not a monster. The diver is not portrayed as a supervillain. Even Bruce is trying to be good. This moral ambiguity gives the story a surprising maturity. It recognizes that harm does not always come from hatred. Sometimes people hurt others because they do not understand them. Sometimes love becomes controlling because fear disguises itself as responsibility. Sometimes the environment is dangerous without being malicious. Those ideas remain accessible because they are embedded in action rather than lectures. That does not mean the film is beyond criticism. The environmental irony surrounding clownfish is the most obvious example. A story centered on the freedom of marine life could contribute to increased demand for marine pets, creating pressure that the narrative itself never intended. The problem is not necessarily a flaw in the movie's message, but it demonstrates that cultural products can produce consequences outside their creators' control. The Tank Gang's subplot has also attracted criticism from viewers who feel that its sitcom-like rhythm occasionally interrupts the urgency of Marlon's journey. That criticism is understandable. The film moves between two very different narrative modes, an expansive rescue adventure and a confined ensemble comedy. For some viewers, the contrast creates richness. For others, it creates pacing interruptions. Yet the subplot performs an important structural function. Without the Tank Gang, Nemo would remain primarily an object of Marlon's rescue mission. The aquarium storyline gives him his own narrative. He is not simply waiting for his father. He is learning, failing, adapting, and contributing. The question of Dory's memory loss is more complicated. The film uses it for comedy, but her condition is also central to the emotional argument. Some modern viewers may feel uncomfortable with the way memory impairment becomes a recurring source of jokes. Others see Dory as one of the film's most empathetic characters precisely because her memory difference never prevents her from forming meaningful relationships. The tension is real. The film was created in a cultural context different from today's conversations about disability and mental health. Its characterization can be compassionate while still containing elements that deserve scrutiny. Recognizing that does not diminish the film. It makes the analysis more honest. A timeless movie does not need to be flawless. It needs to remain rich enough that new generations can question it without exhausting its meaning. Financially, Finding Nemo changed the balance of power around Pixar. Its production budget was substantial for its time, but the theatrical return transformed the film into a major commercial asset. The movie's success, combined with Pixar's broader run of hits, strengthened the studio's position during its increasingly tense relationship with Disney. The important business lesson was not simply that animated films could make hundreds of millions. Disney already knew that. The lesson was that Pixar could generate original characters and worlds with enormous commercial value. Nemo, Dory, Marlin, and the broader visual identity of the film were not based on an established franchise. They became the franchise. Home video amplified that success. In the early 2000s, DVD sales were still a major component of a film's long-term revenue, and Finding Nemo became one of the era's major home video successes. The movie could be revisited repeatedly, which was especially valuable for families. Children could watch it again and again, while adults could discover details they missed the first time. This repeatability strengthened the film's cultural penetration. It also demonstrated the commercial power of Pixar's storytelling model: invest heavily in original characters, build an emotionally universal premise, create visual assets that can extend into merchandise and attractions, and allow the audience to become attached to the world before expanding it. Nemo helped prove that original animated IP could become a major corporate asset without being based on a pre-existing toy line or fairy tale. The film's eventual sequel strategy was equally revealing. Pixar waited 13 years before returning to this world with Finding Dory. That delay is significant because it reflects both confidence and caution. Nemo had become valuable enough to justify a sequel, but Pixar did not immediately exploit the property. Finding Dory shifted the emotional center toward Dory's fear of losing her own identity and her struggle to reconstruct a connection with her parents. In doing so, it demonstrated how the original film structure could support another character's perspective. The broader Pixar formula became increasingly recognizable during this era. Begin with an accessible high concept, attach it to profound emotional damage, build the story around a mismatched partnership, and use a fantastical environment to force the characters into psychological change. But Finding Nemo remains one of the clearest examples because the external adventure and internal conflict are so closely synchronized. Every major obstacle pressures the same question: can Marlin love Nemo without controlling him? That question gives the film a structural unity that many sequels and imitators struggle to reproduce. The success of Nemo also reinforced the idea that audiences would follow original animated stories if the emotional premise was strong enough. A movie did not need a fairy tale princess, a talking toy franchise, or an existing comic book mythology. It needed characters whose problems felt real. Historically, Finding Nemo belongs to one of the most remarkable creative periods in Hollywood animation. Its Academy Award for Best Animated Feature confirmed what audiences already knew: Pixar had become a dominant force in mainstream cinema. Its screenplay also received major recognition, reinforcing the idea that animation could be judged by the same standards of narrative craft applied to live-action cinema. The achievement was not simply that Pixar could make beautiful images. By this point, computer graphics had already demonstrated their visual potential. The breakthrough was the integration of technical innovation with emotional storytelling. The ocean's complexity exists to support the characters. The lighting exists to communicate mood. The scale exists to create vulnerability. The sound exists to make the environment physical. Nothing feels like technology added for its own sake. That principle helped establish new expectations for digital cinema. Environmental storytelling could now be both technically complex and emotionally legible. Pixar's early 2000s run, from Monsters Incorporated through Finding Nemo and into The Incredibles and beyond, became one of the most extraordinary creative hot streaks in modern Hollywood. What makes Nemo stand out within that run is its unusual emotional premise. It is not fundamentally about ambition, identity, or friendship. It is about fear inside a parent-child relationship.